This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. In the quiet, picturesque town of Lilburn, Georgia, there was a family that everyone admired. The Zulo household was an emblem of what many considered the ideal life: a beautiful home on a tree-lined street, meticulously manicured lawns, and a couple that seemed to exude warmth and stability at every turn. William and Zachary Zulo were known not only for their success in their respective fields, but also for their unwavering commitment to community. He told they had built their lives with care, and from the outside, it seemed as though nothing could shake their perfect existence. William had grown up in a small town where family values were paramount. His upbringing instilled in him a deep sense of duty and service. After graduating from a local college, he found his calling in public service, working as a government employee. His career was one that reflected his attention to detail and meticulous approach to everything he did. Colleagues spoke highly of his dependability and strong work ethic, admiring his ability to handle even the most difficult tasks with ease. Outside of his job, William had an innate desire to help others, regularly volunteering for local events and charitable causes. He took pride in being a part of something larger than himself, and his sense of responsibility to those around him became an integral part of his identity. It was no surprise that, as he climbed the ranks of his profession, he was held in high regard by those who knew him, admired not just for his work but for his genuine kindness and commitment to making the world a better place. Zachary, on the other hand, had a different story. Raised in the suburbs of Atlanta, he was known for his sharp intellect and magnetic charm. He had a natural ability to make people feel at ease, to light up any room he walked into. Zachary was a skilled banker, able to break down complex financial strategies with ease. His clients trusted him implicitly, often turning to him for advice on significant financial decisions. But it wasn't just his professional acumen that earned him respect. It was his social nature. Zachary was an integral part of the community, attending charity fundraisers, supporting local initiatives, and making sure to be present at all the events that brought the community together. He was always the first to step up to lend a hand, and the last to leave any gathering. His polished demeanor and infectious enthusiasm made him popular among his peers. His reputation was one of generosity and charisma, with everyone seeing him as the life of the party, someone who could be counted on to make every occasion memorable. When William and Zachary met at a professional networking event, it didn't take long for them to realize they were meant to be together. Their relationship grew quickly, fueled by a shared vision for the future, a future centered around giving back to their community and making a difference in the world. Their dynamic complemented each other perfectly. William was steady, grounded, and practical, while Zachary brought energy, creativity, and passion. Together, they felt unstoppable. It didn't take long for their love story to turn into a lifelong commitment. They married in a beautiful outdoor ceremony in Atlanta, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues who had supported them through the years. The day was a reflection of the life they intended to build, one rooted in love, unity, and a shared desire to create something meaningful together. Their wedding was a grand affair, full of joy and laughter, a celebration of their deep connection. The vows they exchanged were heartfelt and sincere, filled with promises of love and devotion. They spoke of building a home together, one filled with purpose, kindness, and compassion. The guests marveled at how well they complemented each other. William's calming presence balanced Zachary's vibrant energy. They were a couple that seemed destined to change the world around them, to create a family that would be as loving as the one they had built together. Their marriage, to those on the outside, was a symbol of success, the culmination of a shared dream to build a life not just for themselves, but for the children they hoped to adopt in the future. Adoption was a natural next step for William and Zachary, a way to expand their family and share their good fortune with children who needed love and stability. They connected with a Christian special needs adoption agency that placed children from difficult backgrounds into stable, loving homes. After going through a thorough screening process, William and Zachary were introduced to two brothers who had been through a series of foster homes. The boys, still young, had experienced trauma and instability early in their lives. The idea of having permanent, loving parents was a distant dream, but William and Zachary offered them that hope, and the adoption process was set in motion. When the brothers moved into the Zulo home, they were greeted with open arms. The couple spared no effort in making the boys feel welcome. They threw family parties, took the children on vacations, and ensured that every birthday was a cause for celebration. The boys, once timid and uncertain, began to show signs of blooming under the couple's care. They smiled more, laughed more, and began to believe that they had finally found a home they could call their own. Neighbors often remarked on the positive changes in the boys, noting how their spirits seemed to brighten as they settled into their new life. The Zulos had created the perfect family dynamic, a loving home where the children felt safe and valued. The couple's commitment to their adopted children made them not only admired, but beloved in their community. To the outside world, the Zulo family was a picture-perfect example of what it meant to love and nurture. William and Zachary's devotion to their children was a source of inspiration for many. They were seen at school events, cheering their sons on at soccer games, and participating in community activities that brought families together. They were a fixture at local charity events, always present, always willing to help. In every way, they seemed to embody the values of family love and kindness. Their home was an example of success, the culmination of years of hard work, generosity, and a shared vision of what family could be. It was everything that any community could hope for. A couple who had taken children who were once lost and given them a future. A couple who made everything look effortless. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family, cracks were beginning to form. There were subtle signs that no one noticed at first. The boys, who had once been full of life and joy, began to show signs of withdrawal. They were quieter, more reserved, and seemed to shy away from certain situations. They clung to each other more often, and some neighbors began to notice that they seemed uncomfortable when left alone with their adoptive father. These small changes were dismissed as growing pains, as normal adjustments to a new life. But what no one could have known was that the image of the perfect family was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. What seemed to be a story of hope and transformation was masking something far darker. And no one suspected that within the walls of that idyllic home, the boys were enduring unimaginable harm. However, as the months passed after the boys moved into the Zulo home, the initial joy of their new life began to show subtle cracks that went unnoticed by most. At first, their transformation seemed nothing short of remarkable. The boys, who had arrived timid and uncertain, slowly blossomed under the care of their adoptive parents. They laughed more, smiled more, and their once dull eyes seemed to brighten with each passing day. Neighbors and teachers observed these changes and praised the couple for their nurturing approach. To the outside world, the Zulos were doing everything right. Their home had become a symbol of what a loving family could provide, a place of stability, security, and care. However, despite the apparent improvement in their behavior, there were small, almost imperceptible signs that something was wrong. These early signs of distress were fleeting, easily dismissed by the people around them, but they were there, quietly building as the foundation of the boys' traumatic experience began to take shape. It began with subtle shifts in their personalities, things that teachers and neighbors initially attributed to the natural growing pains of children adjusting to a new environment. The once snatchive and outgoing boys started withdrawing. They no longer eagerly participated in class discussions, and their once expressive faces became more reserved, less animated. Teachers, who had known the boys as engaging and curious students, now noticed a change. They were quieter, more distant, as if the light in their eyes had dimmed. The excitement that had once radiated from them when learning new things seemed to fade. Instead of raising their hands eagerly or volunteering answers in class, they became passive, often sitting quietly at their desks, looking down at their books without much interest. At first, these changes were seen as normal challenges of adjusting to a new home, a new school, and a new life. The boys were still young, and their early years had been filled with instability. Many people thought it was simply the trauma of their past catching up with them. They had been shuffled through numerous foster homes before finding the Zulos, and their unsettled early years could easily explain their cautiousness and hesitation to engage fully in their new surroundings. Now that he was completely routed from the Zulos, he quickly realized how important it was for him to stay in touch. Attention to detail But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the signs of distress became harder to ignore. Outside the classroom, the boys' behavior became even more telling. Neighbors started to notice that they clung to each other more than they had in the beginning. They were inseparable, always within arm's reach of one another, as if afraid to be alone. Even during casual interactions, the boys seemed to be constantly checking in with each other, exchanging glances and shifting nervously. It was almost as if they were waiting for something, as if they were anticipating an event or action that they feared would happen. In social settings, they appeared tense, their bodies rigid and their eyes scanning the room, always looking for reassurance. While most children at their age were forming bonds with their peers, the brothers stayed close, their connection to each other growing stronger in a way that felt abnormal for children their age. The once playful and independent boys now seemed coiled tight, unable to relax in the presence of others. Even at home, where they were supposed to feel the safest, something was off. The boys no longer eagerly greeted their parents with the enthusiasm they once had. The familiar faces of William and Zachary, who had once been the source of their comfort, now seemed to bring a sense of unease. There were moments when the boys would flinch at unexpected movements, or avoid eye contact when their father spoke to them. It wasn't obvious to anyone who didn't know them well, but the unease was palpable to those who were paying attention. Small things, like the way they recoiled when a hand was raised, or how they would hurriedly look away when spoken to, began to stand out. No one thought much of it at first. Children can be sensitive, and adjusting to a new family dynamic was undoubtedly a challenge. Still, the boys' demeanor remained unsettlingly distant, as though something in their environment was making them uncomfortable, even fearful. The unease wasn't limited to their interactions with William and Zachary. When other adults, teachers, neighbors, or family friends spoke to the boys, they often seemed to shrink away. They would give short, evasive answers, avoiding any deeper connection. They no longer sought attention or approval in the same way they once had. When asked about their day or their interests, their responses were flat, lacking the enthusiasm that once characterized them. They no longer spoke excitedly about their latest school projects or upcoming birthdays. Instead, their conversations were stilted and guarded. Their smiles, once so genuine and open, were now tight, forced, and fleeting. They were no longer the spontaneous bursts of laughter or the infectious energy they had once exhibited. One of the most unsettling aspects was how they seemed to avoid being left alone with their adoptive parents. The boys, who had initially spent much of their time eagerly following William and Zachary around the house, began to withdraw into corners or find ways to stay near each other. They avoided being left alone with either of the men, preferring to stay in common areas or in places where other people were present. If they were alone in a room with either William or Zachary, they would grow visibly tense, their bodies rigid, their eyes darting around, as if they were expecting something to happen. This subtle shift in their behavior wasn't enough to raise immediate alarm for most people, but it created an underlying tension that grew more pronounced as time. The boys' decline in academic performance also began to show. Where they had once been bright and engaged in their studies, they now struggled to concentrate. Their grades began to drop, and their teachers noted how difficult it was to get them to participate in class discussions. They were still capable children, but their lack of focus and engagement raised concerns. Their once vibrant curiosity seemed to vanish, replaced by a quiet passivity. Even when praised for their work, they seemed uninterested in the recognition. Their once curious minds, eager to explore and learn, now appeared shut off, as if something had stifled their joy for discovery. The final signal came from their increasing dependence on each other. The brothers, once playful and independent, now appeared to be relying on each other in a way that seemed almost unnatural. They rarely left each other's side, whispering to each other in hushed tones, often seeming to communicate in ways that no one else could understand. Their closeness had shifted from sibling bonding to a kind of dependency that was both unsettling and heartbreaking. There was no joy in their connection now, no lightness in the way they held on to one another. It was as though they were trying to protect each other from something, trying to make sure they were never apart, as if their bond was the only thing that kept them safe. Despite these troubling signs, the community, family and friends remained unaware. William and Zachary were pillars of the community, known for their kindness, generosity, and dedication to their children. No one wanted to believe that anything was wrong. The boys' withdrawn behavior, their subtle signs of distress, were dismissed as part of the adjustment process, chalked up to a difficult past that would take time to overcome. But those who had seen the early signs of distress in the boys could never have known the true extent of what was happening behind the doors of that seemingly perfect home. The boys' pain was buried beneath layers of denial and misplaced trust, their voices silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The signs were there, but they were invisible to those who didn't know to look. And in the silence, the boys continued to suffer. It was a quiet, ordinary day when the truth began to unravel, and in many ways it was the last thing anyone expected. For years, the Zulo family had been the model of perfection, their home a symbol of stability and success in the tight-knit community of Lilburn. William and Zachary were beloved by all, admired for their generosity, their tireless work in the community, and the loving home they had provided for their two adopted sons. To outsiders, the Zulos were everything that one could hope for in a family: happy, successful, and completely devoted to each other. The truth, however, had been simmering under the surface, obscured by the perfect facade that they had carefully crafted. No one knew, or at least no one had the courage to ask, what was truly happening behind closed doors. It was the boys' teacher, Mrs. Freeman, who first began to sense that something was deeply wrong. She had known the boys for over a year and had watched them change from eager, bright-eyed children into withdrawn, somber students. While the shift had been gradual, there were moments that stood out to her as troubling. The boys were no longer the talkative, energetic children they had once been. They now spent most of their days sitting quietly at their desks, avoiding eye contact with their classmates and with her. Mrs. Freeman had a keen sense for noticing when a child was in distress, and the boys' increasingly distant behavior raised her suspicions. She had tried talking to them, gently asking if there was anything bothering them, but their responses were always the same. They would look away, mumble something about being fine, and quickly retreat into silence. But something in their eyes told her that this wasn't true. One afternoon, during a routine parent-teacher meeting, Mrs. Freeman mentioned her concerns to William and Zachary. She spoke carefully, trying to remain diplomatic, but it was clear that she was worried. The boys' withdrawal had become more pronounced, and she feared they might be struggling with something that wasn't related to school at all. William listened intently, nodding politely, while Zachary's expression remained fixed and unreadable. They reassured her, as they always did, that the boys were just going through an adjustment period. They had come from difficult backgrounds after all, and they were simply taking longer to settle in. Mrs. Freeman, though skeptical, accepted their explanation. She left the meeting with the nagging feeling that she was missing something, but at the time, she didn't know what. That evening, as Mrs. Freeman sat in her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was a sense of urgency in her gut that she couldn't ignore. The boys had never been like this before. Their changes were not typical for children who had been through trauma. This was something different, something darker, something that didn't fit. It was then that she made a decision. She would not let this go. She had to know more, even if it meant stepping into uncomfortable territory. The next day, Mrs. Freeman quietly spoke to the school counselor, Miss Williams. She had known her for years and trusted her judgment. Mrs. Freeman recounted her concerns about the boys' behavior, explaining how they had become more withdrawn and how their responses to her attempts to talk seemed evasive. Miss Williams listened carefully and, after a long pause, agreed that there was something more going on. She suggested that they conduct a discreet meeting with the boys in private, away from their parents. The school had protocols for such situations, and Miss Williams had dealt with similar cases in the past. They could not ignore the possibility that the boys were hiding something, and they needed to approach this delicately. After the meeting was arranged, Mrs. Freeman and Miss Williams met with the boys in the counselor's office. The boys were quiet, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes darting nervously around the room. It was clear that they were uncomfortable, as though they were bracing for something. Ms. Williams began by gently reassuring them that they were safe, that they could talk to her without fear of punishment. She asked them if anything was wrong, if they felt scared or uncomfortable at home. For a long time, there was only silence. The boys exchanged furtive glances, as if weighing whether or not to speak. Then, almost in unison, they looked at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the adults in the room. It was the younger of the two brothers, Thomas, who spoke first. His voice was barely a whisper, and he seemed to shrink back into his chair as if trying to make himself invisible. "Sometimes, I don't like being at home," he said softly. There was a long pause as Mrs. Freeman and Ms. Williams exchanged glances. They waited for him to continue, but he was hesitant, unsure if he should say more. The counselor gently pressed him, offering reassurances that no one would hurt him for telling the truth. I don't like when they're alone with us," Thomas continued, his voice shaking. It's scary." Mrs. Freeman's heart sank as she listened, her own breath catching in her chest. The boys had never mentioned anything like this before. She turned her attention to the older brother, Jacob, who had remained silent, his body stiff and tense. Ms. Williams asked him if he felt the same way, but he only nodded, his lips pressed tightly together, unwilling to speak. "Why is it scary?" Mrs. Freeman asked, her voice barely a whisper. The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. It was Thomas who answered, his voice breaking as he spoke. They make us do things we don't want to do, things that aren't right." Those words, so simple yet so powerful, hung in the air like a heavy fog. Mrs. Freeman felt as though the world had stopped moving. She knew what those words meant, and yet she couldn't quite believe them. The boy's confession was clear now, though the full extent of what had happened to them remained uncertain. She glanced at Ms. Williams, who immediately sprang into action, comforting the boys and assuring them that they would be protected. But Mrs. Freeman was already mentally calculating the next steps, understanding that this wasn't something that could be handled alone. The following days were a blur of meetings with Child Protective Services, police, and therapists. The investigation was launched quickly, but there was a sense of urgency that none of them could ignore. The boys' revelations were chilling, but they were just the beginning of a far deeper, more horrifying truth. It became clear that the boys had been enduring years of abuse, hidden behind the facade of the perfect family. The signs had been there all along, subtle at first: withdrawn behavior, avoidance of physical contact, a palpable sense of fear whenever they were alone with their adoptive parents. But no one had seen them. No one had questioned the perfection of the Zulo family. The investigation into the Zulos uncovered a pattern of manipulation, control, and exploitation that shook the community to its core. The abuse had been systematic and insidious, hidden behind the mask of caring parents who seemed to have it all. William and Zachary had skillfully built a reputation as pillars of the community, using their public personas to deflect any suspicion that might arise. They had used their power and influence to maintain their image, ensuring that no one would question their behavior. It wasn't until the boys found the courage to speak out that the truth was exposed. The discovery of this dark truth was a moment that shattered the illusion of perfection that had once surrounded the Zulo family. What had appeared to be a loving, idyllic home was, in reality, a house of horror. And though the community would never forget the betrayal, the boys were finally free to begin their healing process, no longer silenced by the weight of their suffering. The discovery, while tragic, marked the beginning of their journey toward recovery, a journey that would take time, but one that would ultimately lead them to the safety and peace they had longed for. As the tension within the Zulo household deepened, the once perfect illusion of their family life began to crack, though no one outside the immediate family suspected anything was amiss. The boys' growing unease was dismissed by many, their struggles written off as the lingering effects of their traumatic past. The neighborhood saw William and Zachary as the ideal couple, a model for what loving parents should be. And their involvement in local charity events and school activities seemed to reinforce this perception. But beneath the surface, a quiet storm was brewing, one that would soon come to light in ways no one could have predicted. The catalyst for the investigation came unexpectedly in the form of a routine visit to the family pediatrician. It was a visit the boys had been required to attend for a general checkup, a formality that, like many others, had always been conducted without issue. However, during the examination, the pediatrician noticed something strange. The younger boy, who had once been a lively and outgoing child, now seemed distant and uncomfortable under even the slightest touch. His body was stiff and unresponsive, and he flinched when the doctor attempted to check his abdomen. Something about his behavior set off a small alarm in the pediatrician's mind. The boy's eyes were dull, avoiding contact, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, as if bracing for something. The doctor noted the boy's tense posture, the way his lips trembled when asked questions, and the subtle signs of physical discomfort that didn't match the child's medical history. There was nothing overtly wrong in terms of the boy's health, but the shift in his behavior struck the pediatrician as unusual. Though the pediatrician had no solid evidence of abuse, the signs were troubling enough to prompt a routine inquiry. The doctor gently probed further, asking the boy about his life at home, about his parents and his school. The boy's answers were short, evasive, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. He said everything was fine, that he loved his new home, but the hesitation in his voice was palpable. The pediatrician made a mental note to report these concerns to the proper authorities, but remained cautious, aware that children in difficult circumstances often have trouble articulating the pain they are experiencing. A few days after the appointment, the pediatrician placed a call to the local child welfare services, triggering what would become an increasingly complex and tense investigation. The initial report was simply a routine follow-up on the boy's health, but the mention of his uncharacteristic behavior and the discomfort he displayed during the examination caught the attention of the social workers assigned to the case. They began to investigate the Zulo family, first by looking into the boys' school records, their medical history, and speaking with neighbors who had known the family for years. What they found, at first glance, seemed to support the image of a perfectly normal, loving family. There were no red flags in the boys' school reports. They were well-behaved students, involved in activities, and had been generally viewed as healthy and happy children. There was no reason to believe that anything could be wrong, but as the social workers dug deeper, something began to stand out. When they interviewed the boys' teachers, they learned that the children's behavior had changed significantly over the past few months. They had become more withdrawn, quieter in class, and less eager to participate in social activities. One teacher remarked that she had seen a noticeable difference in the boys' engagement level, even though they were still performing well academically. Another teacher mentioned that the younger boy in particular seemed to be fearful and often avoided eye contact when spoken to. This consistent pattern of withdrawal was concerning, and it began to raise questions that weren't so easily explained by their past trauma. The social workers then turned their attention to the boy's neighbors. They spoke with people who had interacted with the family regularly, neighbors who had seen the Zulos at community gatherings, church events, and local charity drives. The picture painted by those who knew the family best was one of a picture-perfect couple. William and Zachary were always smiling, always helping, and always present at social events. The boys were never far from their sides, always at ease and seemingly enjoying the family outings. No one had seen anything that would suggest there was any cause for concern. But the social workers, determined to uncover the truth, knew that the perfect image the Zulos projected couldn't tell the whole story. They began to ask more pointed questions, probing deeper into the dynamics of the family, focusing on the changes in the boys' behavior. So during their investigation, they began to observe the boys more closely. They attended community events where the family was present, watching from a distance as the Zulos interacted with others. William and Zachary were always charming, always friendly, but the boys were more withdrawn than they had been at the beginning. They no longer played freely with the other children at school or during social gatherings. Instead, they stayed close to each other, never venturing too far from their fathers. At times, they appeared visibly tense, their eyes darting around the room as if bracing for something to happen. Though they still interacted with others, their smiles seemed forced, their laughter hollow. Despite their growing concerns, there was still no concrete evidence that anything was wrong. The social workers didn't know what to make of the subtle signs they had uncovered. They had no physical evidence of abuse, no bruises, no injuries, no overt signs of neglect. But the boys' psychological withdrawal was undeniable. And then, just as they were beginning to feel the weight of uncertainty, an unexpected breakthrough came. One of the boys, the older of the two, had started to open up. It wasn't much at first, just a few quiet words whispered to a trusted school counselor during a routine session. The counselor had noticed the change in the boy's demeanor and had gently probed for more information. The boy had started to speak in fragments, unsure of how much he could share, but what he said was enough to send chills down the counselor's spine. He mentioned, quietly and almost absent-mindedly, that sometimes things in the house weren't what they seemed. He spoke in vague terms, not wanting to name specifics, but his words were filled with fear and confusion. The counselor, having worked with children from difficult backgrounds, immediately understood the gravity of what was being hinted at. Without breaking the boy's trust, she began to gather more information, delicately pushing for him to open up more. The boy spoke of moments when he felt scared, when he didn't feel safe at home. He described the tension between his fathers, the way things felt off, though he didn't know how to explain it. He spoke about how they seemed happy in front of others, but there was something different when they were alone. His words were fragmented, but they gave the social workers just enough to begin piecing together the unsettling truth. At that moment, the investigation began to take a darker turn. The social workers, realizing that the boys might be trying to communicate something far more serious than what had initially been suspected, decided to escalate the case. They arranged for more intensive interviews with the boys, employing experts in child psychology to help them navigate the delicate process. The investigation, which had started as a simple health checkup, was now on a path that would expose the deep secrets buried within the seemingly perfect family. What followed was a careful, methodical unraveling of the Zulos' perfect facade. Each revelation brought with it a deeper sense of dread, as the truth about the family's hidden darkness began to surface. The investigation, which had seemed like a routine inquiry, was now opening doors to a nightmare no one had expected. A nightmare that would ultimately reveal the true extent of the horrors lurking behind closed doors. The trial was a spectacle, something the community would remember for years to come. It was as if the perfect family facade had been shattered irreparably, and now the truth, ugly, horrifying, and completely unexpected, was in full view. The courtroom, typically a place of solemnity and reason, buzzed with anticipation as the legal teams prepared for the most high-profile case in the town's history. Everyone had been following the investigation, from the whispered conversations at coffee shops to the news stories that had spread like wildfire, and now they were about to witness the culmination of all that had been uncovered. William and Zachary Zulo sat side by side at the defense table, their once pristine appearance now marred by the weight of the charges against them. They were still dressed in sharp suits, but the confidence they had once exuded was gone, replaced by a quiet, unsettling tension. The public, who had once seen them as paragons of virtue, now viewed them with a mixture of disbelief and revulsion. No one could reconcile the image of the loving fathers they had projected with the horrific allegations that had come to light. The courtroom was packed, with reporters from all over the country, curious onlookers, and people who had known the family for years. The boys, once seen as the Zulo family's greatest treasures, were no longer at their father's side. They had been placed in the care of a distant relative, removed from the chaos and placed into an environment where they could begin the long process of healing. Their voices, once silenced by fear, would now be heard in the legal proceedings, but not without a heavy emotional toll. The prosecution was relentless, building their case on the testimony of the boys, the observations of social workers, medical professionals, and even neighbors who had started to piece together the truth in hindsight. The boys, though terrified and confused, found the strength to speak out. They had been coaxed and carefully supported by child psychologists, but the sheer weight of their words was enough to send shockwaves through the courtroom. What they revealed about the abuse they had suffered, both physical and emotional, was chilling. It was a portrait of manipulation and control, of a home that had once seemed like a sanctuary, but had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The prosecution also presented expert testimony that outlined the psychological toll the abuse had taken on the boys. Experts described how the boys had been trapped in a cycle of fear and silence, conditioned to believe that what had been happening in their home was normal. The fear of punishment, the isolation, the subtle threats that kept them from speaking out. All of it was laid bare in the courtroom. The expert witnesses painted a picture of deep emotional trauma, showing how the boys had been robbed of their sense of security, their innocence, and their trust in the world around them. The courtroom was silent as the details of their lives unfolded in excruciating detail, with each new revelation pulling the audience deeper into the horror that had been concealed behind closed doors. On the other side, the defense attempted to discredit the accusations, trying to shift the focus away from the boys' testimony and portray the couple as victims of a misunderstanding, a smear campaign driven by jealousy or misinterpretation. Their defense attorneys attempted to question the validity of the boys' statements, suggesting that they might have been influenced by others or that their memories were unreliable. They argued that the Zulus were loving parents, that they had provided for the boys and offered them a stable home. But the more they tried to shift the narrative, the more it became clear that their arguments were nothing more than thinly veiled attempts to protect the facade they had built. The boys' testimonies were too compelling, too consistent to be dismissed as lies or exaggerations. The trial dragged on for weeks, each day revealing more details, more inconsistencies in the defense's story, and more moments that shook the public to its core. As the witnesses took the stand one by one, the weight of the evidence grew heavier. Medical records, photos, and expert opinions all pointed to the same conclusion. The Zulo family was far from the perfect image they had projected. The more the defense tried to maintain the narrative of a loving household, the more they exposed the cracks in that very illusion. In the final days of the trial, after all the evidence had been presented and the testimonies heard, the jury was left to deliberate. The weight of the case hung heavily over them. It wasn't just a matter of legal guilt, it was a matter of the community's belief in the Zulos' innocence. How could two men who had been so involved in charity work, so outwardly dedicated to their family, be guilty of such monstrous acts? The questions swirled around the courtroom, but in the end the evidence was undeniable. The jury found William and Zachary Zulo guilty on all counts. The verdict was swift, and the silence that followed was thick with disbelief. The community that had once hailed them as exemplary parents now recoiled in shock, unable to reconcile the truth with the image they had held so dearly. The sentencing was another somber event. As the judge took his time to explain the severity of the crime, William and Zachary were each sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that was met with mixed emotions. For some, it was a long-awaited justice, a fitting punishment for the suffering the boys had endured. For others, it was a tragic end to a story that had once seemed so full of promise. The boys, now safe in the care of their relative, would have to live with the scars of their experiences for the rest of their lives. But at least they were no longer under the control of the men who had once claimed to love them. In the aftermath, the case continued to reverberate throughout the community. People were left questioning how they could have been so blind, how the signs of abuse had been overlooked for so long. It was a painful reminder of the power of appearances, of how easily people could be deceived by a well-crafted image. The boys' lives were forever changed, but they would never again have to face the nightmare of their past. The legal outcome, though bringing justice, also served as a cautionary tale. Appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the most perfect families are hiding the darkest secrets. The aftermath of the Zulo case left deep scars, but it also ignited a movement for change. Advocacy groups, legal experts, and community members joined forces to address the failures that allowed such atrocities to occur. At the heart of these efforts was a demand for stricter oversight in adoption processes. Background checks, once considered thorough, were now criticized for their inability to detect deeper patterns of manipulation. Adoption agencies began implementing enhanced screening measures, including psychological evaluations, ongoing home visits, and more rigorous training for staff to identify red flags. Beyond systemic reforms, the community rallied around the two young boys who had survived the ordeal. Placed in a safe and supportive environment, the brothers began their journey toward recovery. Therapists specializing in childhood trauma worked tirelessly to help them rebuild trust and regain a sense of safety. Slowly, through therapy and the care of dedicated caregivers, they began to heal, reclaiming small pieces of their stolen childhood. This tragedy also sparked a broader societal conversation about vigilance. Schools, neighbors, and communities were encouraged to pay closer attention to subtle signs of distress in children. Workshops and awareness campaigns focused on identifying behavioral changes and creating safe spaces for children to voice their concerns. While the road to recovery was long, the case left an indelible lesson. Safeguarding children requires collective action, and their safety must always come first.